Hello friends, I'm Pastor Leah Scholl from Wake Forest Baptist Church here in beautiful Winston-Salem. It has been a difficult week. We had a shooting at our neighborhood high school, Mount Tabor, and it has just been a long week. And so hear these words as a blessing. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Today's text from 2 Samuel has been called a terror text. And it's not one that we normally read on a Sunday morning. It's not in the general lectionary, but it is one of the stories that are so important in the Bible. For this text, we need a little bit of background. First, the Gibeonites were the residents of Gibeon, a wealthy city in Canaan, which is present-day Palestine. When Joshua brought the Hebrew people into the land, they quickly won battles in the major cities, including Jericho. The Gibeonites were afraid for their lives. So rather than face the battle, they dressed up in worn clothes and sandals, poured new wine into old skins, took rotten bread for the very short journey, all in a strategic attempt to look like they had traveled a long way. When they arrived in Joshua's camp, they asked for a treaty, ostensibly because they lived so far away and of course were no danger to the Israelites. And Joshua agreed to the treaty without consulting God, P.S. It wasn't until later that Joshua found out the truth, that they were not from far away, but were from very close. So even though the treaty was made without God and without honesty, Joshua honored the treaty. Then we get to 2 Samuel chapter 21 and learn that King Saul sought out the Gibeonites and killed them. In his zeal, this is a quote from the Bible, in his zeal for the children of Israel and Judah. In other words, he violated the treaty. So we find ourselves several years later in Israel with famine in the land. David sought God to find out why. God pointed to the sins of Saul, how he killed the Gibeonites, breaking the treaty. God says there is blood guilt on Saul. So David goes to the Gibeonites and asks how he might make restitution. The Gibeonites ask not for silver or gold, and they cannot take direct revenge on any of those who caused the deaths of the Gibeonites. Saul is dead, and so are many of his people. Instead, the Gibeonites request 7 descendants of Saul to hang them. That's pretty gory, right? So David sent 2 lesser sons of Saul, children of the mother Rizpah, and 5 sons of Merab. I believe they are grandchildren of Saul through his daughter Merab. After her children were killed, mother Rizpah mourned, sitting on a rock, protecting the bodies from birds during the day and animals of prey at night. She sits a sort of subversive Shiva. She raises a revolutionary ruckus, grieving for her children. She stays and she stays and she stays. Then finally, David hears what Rizpah is doing, and he is spurred to action. He gathers the bones of Saul and of David's best friend and Saul's son Jonathan, and then he gathers the bones of the children who were still hanging, and he buries them in an honorable way. After that, it began to rain. The Black womanist liberation theologian Will Gaffney says that this is a study in vengeance, retribution, and reparation. She says we should not conclude that God called David's attention to the blood guilt of Saul as a prerequisite for ending the famine. God did not answer the people's prayers until the remains of the murdered men were placed respectfully to rest. Perhaps God only gave the rains after Rizpah's unrecorded prayers are answered. Maybe Rizpah prayed along with Psalms 58, which Will Gaffney translates, "Then shall the woman born say, surely there is a reward for the righteous. Truly there are divine judgments on earth." Maybe God didn't need the bloodshed for the rain, but God needed reparations for Rizpah for the rain. So what does that mean for you and me living in these mean days? Just days after a shooting at Mount Tabor High School, days when we hear of the deaths of children from the coronavirus, days when we hear of attacks against civilians in Afghanistan, days when we hear the cries from the floods of the Hurricane Ida, days when we hear cries of women in Texas unable to get health care. Can our grief move our leaders? And even more, can our grief move God? Anne Lamott wrote, "All those years I fell for the great palace lie that grief should be gotten over as quickly as possible and as privately. But what I've discovered is that the lifelong fear of grief keeps us in barren, isolated places, and that only grieving can heal grief. The passage of time will lessen the acuteness, but time alone, without the direct experience of grief, will not heal it." And there is so much to grieve right now. A fellow pastor shared some ideas of how to make space for grief, and it's public face, lament, and I thought I'd share a couple of those. One suggestion is to follow the 3 movements of lament in the Psalms. Old Testament professor Carol Bechtel calls them protest, petition, and praise. And trust me when I tell you that the protest can be angry and loud, the petition can be quite whiny, and the praise can be meager. God meets us in our grief and lament where we are at. Another suggestion is that we name how things are and look for God with us in the midst of it. That's precisely what it sounds like. Write down every terrible thing and look to see how God is working in each of those terrible things. And then there's my latest favorite. I know you're all familiar with the idea of a gratitude journal, and I myself have said, oh, this is the best. But right now I've been following a suggestion from the book, The Language of Emotions, where the author suggests making a complaint list instead. And I do this at least once a week. I whine, I curse, I make crass statements, I say ugly things. And usually, by the end of it, I feel better. And sometimes I even laugh. I'm also reminded of the public lament I used to do in college during one of those endless wars we've been a part of. I stood with other Christians at a public crossroads called 5 Points in Birmingham, Alabama, silent and silently praying that God would bring an end to that war. I stood there other times too, praying for an end of violence in Central America and to end the school of the Americas where militants were trained to subvert the movements of the people. We'd stand with signs so that all could see, not violent, in fact, particularly nonviolent, in silence and praying. Y'all, it doesn't matter how you grieve or how you lament, but it does matter that you do it. Take some time this week to really get in touch with all that you are grieving. it will help. I promise. And who knows? Maybe our collective grief can help us find a way out of this mess we're in. Maybe if all the mother-born folks get together to share our laments, to watch over the bones, to declare the horrors of unnecessary death to all who will listen, maybe the warmongers will stop their warring. Maybe the babies in our schools will quit killing other babies in our schools and cities. Maybe the corporate polluters will stop their polluting. Maybe the genocidal oppressors will stop their oppressing. And maybe, just maybe, God will bring the rain. Amen? Amen. I love you and I love being your pastor.